Hello everyone, today we talk about the Byzantine iconoclasm, which is one of the most mysterious topics in early medieval history. In many ways, let's say, a certain interpretation that has remained, in my opinion, valid regarding the reasons of iconoclasm has been criticized profitably at some level. Not much, again, because it's not logical, but because we don't find too much explicit evidence of that. That's not really a good method, in my opinion, to interpret history in the first place, because if you just study even periods like these, the early medieval times, and especially in the Byzantine Empire, so where sources are also peculiarly and increasingly bent towards a specific direction and within a certain frame, and coming from very specific sections of the politics and the political and social body, let's say, you realize that by default we cannot fully know much of what happens. The second problem being, however, true that most of what we know about the iconoclasm comes from the same iconodules, that is to say, the iconophiles that were certain terminology also were invented in the modern age. The same iconoclasm actually doesn't. It's a modern term, actually, attributed to this phase. But let's say the only sources we have about the iconoclasm are of the winners of the iconoclasm itself. That is to say, those who took it away. And paradoxically, we see that within this author's works, texts, there is probably the only there is also a legacy of the same iconoclasm, because the rigid division, as if at some point there was just either you were pro icons or not. By the way, in the Byzantine Empire, say, iconoclasm historically took form like, for example, in Islam, you can't even represent living creatures of any kind, fundamentally. Whereas in the Byzantine Empire, this took the form just of the holy, right? So didn't entail creation altogether. But the fact that it was a rigid separation since the beginning, especially with the iconoclastic controversy, isn't really supported by properly the contemporary sources, the few also that survived from that time. We see rather a pressure exercised by the imperial court at some point on the Greek episcopate, bringing to a council of more than 300 bishops to condemn in 754 the cult of the icons, of the images. And at that time, in fact, the same sources that eventually were to criticize this decision were saying clergy. It didn't really present the picture as if there was a violent imposition, or that there had even been a fracture in the episcopate. But that rather was a great concern, a great debate, a great turmoil. This is especially connected to Leo III, the Isaurian, but it seems that the radicalization took place mostly under his son Constantine V, that were also quite offensively nicknamed, as you know, and because exactly of the iconoclastic controversy, which it seemed that he was a particular supporter of probably in an iconoclastic direction, and that objectively at that point seemed to have taken a more rigid phase. And the history of the iconoclasm, at some point we can do it even more in detail to see what we're talking about. Also, the reasons of the iconoclasm should deserve actually another video entirely. As you know, there have been different hypotheses regarding this literal elimination of the sacred images from the churches, from monasteries, and so on. That definitely corresponded also to factual expoliation of many sacred objects that costed a lot and were probably, in fact, reused for economic purpose at some level. One should, however, ask why this happened, because it really caused a fracture that was not just within the at that point mostly, yes, the let's say Constantinopolitan episcopate by a certain degree, because even if this had to do importantly with the provinces, especially a push that seemingly came from the eastern ones in favor of the iconoclasm, still, at least the debate that we can document revolves around Constantinople, its court, its patriarchate, and yes, there are also, of course, authors from other areas, but of course the center of the empire was increasingly becoming only Constantinople, right? Just as the place where matters were decided in the first place, or at least where, in fact, the decisive moral force of the struggle lay. And some explanations, first of all, have tried to look at a cultural influence. The most let's say, appreciated one connects the possible influences of the Isaurian, Reed, probably Syrian dynasty that was at power at that point from Islam, right? And Islam, iconoclasm in Islam at the same time. This has been criticized, if anything, immediately from properly causal connection, meaning that up to a certain point the same caliphate had produced images, sacred images. We see it even on the coins, etc. And it's rather in opposition to the Byzantine symbolism at some point that they decided instead to bail out completely. Naturally, there is the second commandment properly prohibiting the sacred images. I will see the theological question being a bit more subtle, because naturally that is part of the Old Testament. There is in the divine incarnation in the new one, and so things change, and that's how the iconodules that eventually triumphed naturally justified this thing, that they didn't just connect it to the fact that there was no actual worshipping of a material object in the form properly of the icon and in the wood, the paint, but let's say of the creator of same matter. That, of course, in Orthodoxy, Catholically meant altogether. This was way before the schism, even though there was a lot of attrition with the Western Church as well. Celebrates creation and matter in an anti-Gnostic fashion. In fact, that a right to deny the same incarnation. That's the reason why the Bogomils eventually were the only movement against which the Byzantines waged an actual crusade against. But a crusade, crusades that the Byzantines were really not fond of under any other circumstance, really. But this is yet another problem, and it's interesting how, in part, probably this flowed into, iconoclasm. Probably had some connection with what would become Bogomilism and this other Gnostic resurgence, but that's a completely different topic we don't talk about today. The Islamic influence would have essentially been something at least more complex, because the Abbasid Caliphate became properly iconoclastic only later on. Right? Otherwise, at the beginning, kind of copying the Byzantines. At some point, you have properly a picture of Christ under a verse of some imperial solidity, right? That probably actually sparked that sense of, why shouldn't we take into account the second commandment? The Muslims said, right? And so that brought eventually, even on the Abbasid coins, to eliminate any sacred representation. But at that point, indeed, there was a division along this line, along this pattern. This was true also for the Jews, that also interpret, because, of course, if you don't believe that God incarnated at some point, of course, you just follow the second commandment in the Bible, because there is not that step, right? So the Muslim and Jews would remain like that. And the question regarding the Islamic influence at that point, aside from, again, the Isaurian, or better, Syrian origin, of the imperial dynasty at the time of Iconoclasm that may have received some influence, in fact, from this Semitic Semitic cultures, is it's the one I like, actually, because it does make sense and even probably is simplistic by a certain degree, but it's powerful because it speaks. We're very early in time, in the 8th century, to that kind of universal obsession that any people at the time really had. And when you had this cosmic clash, literally, between Christianity and Islam, the Byzantine Empire versus the Caliphate, where you really see there a hell of an ideological concern at the same time. Because, the Arabs had, at the beginning of the century, arrived under the walls of Constantinople. So there was nothing to kid about. And consider, in fact, that also, therefore, the Byzantine subjects that eventually were, coming back under imperial control east of Constantinople had been also under Islamic rule at some point. And they were Christians, right? Including the sailors of the Islamic fleet that came from the Portugal cities of Egypt, of Palestine, of Syria. And the motive being essentially a competition with Islam, right? That was pointing probably at the second commandment, and so the prohibition of sacred representation, which is also a bit more shaded because in the Bible you have the same Moses being ordered to create some figures of angels, etc., that really actually seem to be in contrast with the same second commandment in part, and that's another story. In fact, it was also used in part by the Iconodules by showing that the second commandment at least hadn't to be interpreted so strictly in a way. But there is a concept at the base of it all, that is to say, it is way more powerful, and this was evident, especially in this still importantly, in fact, active Eastern Mediterranean dimension. That was the plurality of cultures and traditions and the increasing difficulties that universal empires had faced in keeping such communities and their local cults and drifts fundamentally under control. This is particularly true both for the Byzantines and the Muslims. The Byzantine Empire shrank dramatically because of the same Islamic invasions, and it brought to a massive readjustment of the administrative system of the military for controlling territories that up to that point, like in any pre-industrial society, like were not really occupied permanently, like with a direct control, etc. They had basically remained under because of deterrence, right? When the empire shrinks because it loses kind of half of its extension, you don't have just a half of loss in deterrence. You have much more than that. And so in these centuries that are also some of the least documented, in fact, in the same, it's true in all over Europe and the Mediterranean, you have also the decentralization of the imperial government that, as a consequence, think about the teams and so on, would rely ever more on the local dimension. Just recently we were making some videos about Byzantine Italy. At some point we will have to make a video specifically in the anti-iconoclastic reaction in southern Italy, in Sicily. Those were quite impacting things also because of all the politics, the Byzantine policy with the popes, with the Longobards, with the Franks, all right, and that shows you dramatically how Constantinople was mostly just considered like a foreign occupant at that point. It was literally looting the local monasteries and communities because of the excuse of iconoclasm. There is a part of that too. The empire really needed to cash fast, because it was probably also realizing that all those riches scattered in various provinces at some point could fall in somebody else's hands. This is especially evident, and it's not a coincidence of the Italian example, because at that point the Lombards were about to take over the entire peninsula, and then the Franks arrived, which made the thing even scarier for the Byzantines, and those were the richer lands, and also the more distant culturally, so you understand the logic behind that all. But this is true also in the Balkans, and as we explained countless times, the Byzantine civilization was inherited a big deal of the older Hellenic one. It was essentially a urban, coastal one, and that therefore didn't quite consider the hinterland, right, as their world. They lived into this ideal superiority, confined within itself fundamentally as the perfection out of which just chaos and barbarity existed. So even provinces that were quite close, I mean, think about this, are the same times of the threat posed by the Bulgarians. They were just next door, literally, just in terms of sheer distance, it was minimal. Thrace is next door to Constantinople, and you have there important presence. The same Peloponnese that is Slavicized since the migration era in the hinterland. I mean, the other and the world, the rural world, and especially the one, in fact, in which these big monasteries that had developed with a massive emphasis placed on the local cults of the local saints, of the local icons, really seemed, in a sense, to counter the absolute ecumenic, public, orderly, immutable order that the Roman Empire was supposed to embody. So we don't know the causes, really. We don't have, let's say, like, we can't speculate, right? Or better, we don't have the evidence of the causes and the cause-effect connection, especially. But it's possible that, especially facing the Islamic onslaught and having suffered important defeats, because it seems that both the first iconoclastic and the second iconoclastic waves were started, especially the latter is explicitated at the beginning, in the first half of the 9th century, that it was due to it was justified by the losses suffered at the hands of the Muslims, for which the emperor literally said, we have to do something about this now, this thing of the icons. So connecting literally in that instance the cause with this God's punishment, right, of the Romans because of their sins, which was the only possible motivation for which the empire, the only possible empire on earth would be defeated, to, in fact, destroy these icons, because we're considered like a sin, an error, a mistake, Christianly wise. And the Muslims had a bit the same problems, because some said, but look, you can't really say that this thing that the Muslims were really iconoclastic, and so the Byzantines kind of copied them, because look, that when the iconoclasm began, many iconodules fled also in the caliphate, and they were tolerated. Yes, this is true, but this doesn't seem like a very convincing explanation, because first of all, those were Christians, so the Muslims couldn't care less, in a sense, of about that. There would be a broader influence, of course, because if you came to live in lands that were kind of habituated to, at that point, not to have sacred representations by law, etc., you still were not a Muslim. You still kind of go to hell. So who cared of the fact that you would represent the sacred anyway? It's also true that at that point it was extremely convenient, politically speaking, for the caliphs to take the refugees from the Byzantine Empire to show all these frontier populations that, look at how good we are, and so why don't you join, and don't you escape these terrible oppressors now that are destroying your icons, your objects of venerations, and so on. That was kind of an obvious thing. They would do it. There are so many instances historically in the same Middle Ages and among the same peoples of religion just passing over your head, not really giving a damn about it, if you really have to gain something from it in a purpose. I mean, the same Byzantines. I mean, the same Constantinople compromise at some point with the Nestorians, with the Monophysites, with the Monothelites, and in Rome, the popes were saying, what the heck are you doing? And so you can't really say, well, no, just because the caliphs took the iconodule refugees, you can't say that the caliphate was a cause, Islamic influence was a cause of the iconoclasm itself. It surely was one of the causes, probably also one of the larger ones, at least by sources of influence, in a way. And the obvious purpose being having this greater unity. It seemed like that, because you see, if you suffer military reverses at the hands of an infidel, and the infidel is actually boasting this, not just kind of a literal interpretation of the Bible that you maybe up to that point haven't focused dramatically on. There had only been some malaise since especially Justinian times, where there was a proliferation of icons from the side of the political and religious establishment. Said, this is taking too much of a disturbing drift. It looks more like politism or something. But you still see that in that world, that again is the caliphate is a concurrent ecumenic empire that wants to wipe you out, as it's a raison d'etre, and vice versa. If they can assert that degree of homogeneity, right, to the point, in fact, that they are able to successfully prohibit the sacred representation, so showing to have the power to literally, interfere with something that is so kind of natural in a way, like, representing the sacred in a way, even just artistically, etc. The Muslims had interesting ways to get, to get past this problem. For example, especially we've seen it in some videos we made on Islamic banners and flags, etc. Especially these peoples that came just from Central Asia, that had just been converted to Islam. And they obviously retained their symbolism, their especially their zoomorphic one, etc. They would use to literally draw those symbols, those animals, etc. with that. Again, as we were saying before, the Muslims were even stricter. No creation could be represented. They would kind of draw that animal. Say, think about the Ayyubid banner. With a lion, if I'm not wrong, with letters of the Quran. They made they picked a verse or something that they wrote it, making take the shape of the lion, like that would form the animal. It's beautiful because you're actually just writing the Quran, but you're also drawing something in the meanwhile. And there is actually, as we were saying before, especially in the early Islamic era, a beautiful phytomorphism, zoomorphism, because at the beginning, you see, these concerns were not even there. Like, you don't have a monotheism, and from the day after, like just at that point, we're occupying mostly Byzantine lands, and also the Sasanian ones were going towards a kind of an enotheistic thing. So already these cultures hadn't quite stuck to that. And you eliminate, with the ridiculous coercive means of the time, any representation everywhere. Right, it takes time, and it has to be wanted, it has to be nurtured, something that takes a long time. That's in part also why the iconoclasm failed, because there weren't properly the theological premises for this. Here we're not going to compare the reasons why eventually in Islam this thing, in fact, not even there held, but at least at the time was important, because it was a show, it was a display of power in this competition, with ideological competition with the other empire. That is, they said, look at what we can do. We can oblige basically all our populations not to represent too much of the sacred images, and you can't. And you have something that is so fragmented in all the various provinces. They all have different cults, different traditions, different saints, that looks like more a polytheistic, heathen stuff. Much worse than, you being heathen because you're just of the other monotheism. Or at least in theory they would think it was the same monotheism, but you had just gotten it wrong. And because, of course, there was some kind of sense of camaraderie in spite of ferocious interreligious clash among, say, monotheists versus what had remained pagan. Also there, according to the current convenience. And so the Byzantine Empire had never regulated this before, right? As we were saying, in this great moment of expansion and prosperity that was the Justinian era, at least before the plague, etc., there had been a huge proliferation of images, of saints especially, but also of angels, right? Of Christ, of course, of the Virgin, etc. And think about how prominent these are also probably in the Greek Orthodox culture in general, and how they have been reinforced, in fact, after the Iconoclasm. There is properly a festivity, a holiday in the Orthodox calendar that is dedicated to the triumph of the iconodules, right? So the defeat of the Iconoclasm is celebrated still today officially, and so after that there was a further exploit, and so the icons, as we most remember, is this beautiful masterworks of late medieval, early modern times that are quite beautiful, etc. But before, this need of representation so was quite prominent there, and it was, say, during Justinian times, at least also because of other reasons that are a bit complex to explain, that had to do also with the very heavy Germanic influx, which is somewhat overlooked at that point, the angelic figures, this commixing between pagan and Christian symbolism that at that point still remained ambiguous. And already at that point, you could find, because you see, in these cities, mostly where the problem was, where at least was more evident to the ruling classes, that icons were every freaking where. Like if you had walked normally in the ancient world, there were representations of deities everywhere, because people, especially the mobs that were superstitious, etc., they believed that there was this constant protection, in fact, probably a material connection with it. And in fact, iconoclasm, I've never read studies about this, but opens the interesting chapter also whether, aside from the theological issues that eventually solved the matter, but how much need there was in a moment of revival of the empire, also during after the, let's call it, in the Dark Ages, that also never quite existed, but let's say in this moment of great revival of the empire after, in fact, the Justinian times was the greatest one. After were contractions, even before the crisis of the 7th century, etc. The imperial authorities wanted to reaffirm properly that Apollonian celestial let's say simply rendered uniqueness, and even graphically speaking, even almost geometrical influence of the older order, if you want, even what the Indo-European original one was, whereas the multitude, the proliferation of lesser deities, especially among the mobs in the Pelagian world, what had been kept under by the elite, had always been prominent because they were kind of more chthonic connected, and especially in this physical connection that disturbed theologically in fact because of this kind of pretty ambiguous relation with the icon, right? By a certain degree, there had always been the concern that these icons would not be just venerated, but worshipped like the true sacred, which was and still is a heresy, in that, in fact, the same iconodules were quite strict in defining after the iconoclasm. That is to say, like today, icons or other sacred objects, etc., relics were also very important in this regard already at the time, have to be venerated. Worshipping them is just idolatry, right? And so it's actually hellish, it's anti-Christian, it has nothing to do, it's a superstition, right? So, and still, think about the time that the pagan world was not very distant. In some of the, especially in the countryside, etc., yeah, these were namely Christians, but objectively, what did they even understand about religion anyway? Right? They kept their own agrarian cults dating from millennia before. They didn't even pose themselves the problem, nor the church properly ever really cared about the peasantry in that sense, right? If because the peasantry was kind of defenseless, was brought under, but this thing had assumed such huge proportions also in the urban centers that was disturbing, and also in the countryside, as we've seen, especially in the centralized provinces, in the Balkans, in Italy, etc., there had been a huge monastic development in the countryside that had somewhat opposed also the secular clergy, the most important, the archbishopric, the metropolitic power that was the closest one, also with the secular power of the imperial one, I mean, and that had gathered the peasant masses around. In fact, these major lords that factually the lordships that the monasteries had become, let's say, emphasizing, inflating literally the worship of the icon in dramatic shows that we, like in the modern secular world, we don't understand anymore. I mean, not even in those countries that where you see, I don't know, people have visions of the time, are superstitious, they believe in this stuff. Actually, we can't see today in ways that are impossible to neurocognitively replicate, because they literally belong to a past that is so distant and so different, especially from us, that we cannot understand. But it was meant all for these people. Literally, the proximity to the icon, to the relic, was conceived as magnifying, for example, the value of prayer. This was conceived also in quite still negotiable pagan fashion, like, you know, if I give you something, you give me something back, which is not really what Christianity really means, especially through prayer, in a way. But the difference again with the older world was minimal, right? And this was assuming disturbing proportions. And Constantinople thought well to say why this should go on, and especially these monastic centers are really also fueling sometimes resistance, again, centralization. Again, let's stress that this was a moment of reaffirmation of imperial power after centuries of contraction. This is the 8th century revival. All Europe is re-expanding, right? And so in this moment, the rural interland provinces were starting to say, no, we don't want to come back under a greater central pressure. We don't want to pay more taxes, etc. So these monasteries were fueling also actively a resistance that was not just political, but it was ideological, was religious, because it said, look, these people are just different from us. Their religiosity, their spiritual life is different. They live in other places. They have other hierarchies. They have other values. They have another culture. And it was even true, right? And so a renewed universal power could not tolerate this. First of all, because of this internal resistance, probably also, in fact, because the Muslims were quite dangerous and powerful, and they were able to achieve that, instead the kind of neutralization of the sacred representations, depictions, and why wouldn't the mighty Roman Empire not be able to do that? Was an issue, right? And this is probably the motivation of it. And don't think that the iconoclast emperors weren't really believing, together with lots of other people, frankly, that this was an issue. It seemed especially that the eastern provinces were quite supportive of this measure, whereas the others were really opposed to that. In fact, the same papacy, that is a kind of a thermometer very often for understanding better the same Constantinopolitan ecclesiastical policy, condemned firmly iconoclasm. We don't have too many details, but the grounds were likely the same, that eventually would bring the iconodules back in power later on. The iconoclasm was taken out in the same Byzantine Empire, right? And this is surely an important explanation why it would be a deep concern theologically, to tolerate something that was seen as, at least was in a way perceived as a problem. And again, we don't really know the intentions, whether this was a way to pillage the monasteries, to affirm a greater control on those communities. It's likely. It's likely also in the frontier area against Islam that was quite unstable, and so there were really causes of major force for imposing sometimes harsher means, even just to make an example anywhere in the empire, and to reaffirm that sense of control, right? And this would justify, and it seems in fact the emperors at the beginning were kind of surprised even by the resistance that they met eventually when they introduced the iconoclasm, because they probably didn't expect it either, and always realize what the at least of that size, because what was also the mentality of an 8th century Byzantine emperor was an idea of sacred, probably an autocracy that was extremely powerful. This was even in a way more powerful than in the West as far as the individual power was concerned. I mean, literally those characters of autocrat, etc., you don't really find them in the West and in the East. Even though this is being criticized, because said, yeah, those characters were maintained, but it kind of sclerotized the rest of the social order, and so in the West there was actually fresher kind of military imperium to bring on the foreign, to channel, and so on. That's yet another interpretation, but at least the idea that, you know, an emperor would say something, it had to be obeyed directly, was extremely powerful. Again, we're in 754 AD. I don't know if you realize, right, what it means. Like, the Islamic invasions were just 100 years before. It's an incredibly primitive and archaic time. The mentality hasn't still seen that major kind of humanistic development would start gradually in the following centuries. It was a ferocious world. It was an incredibly impositive world. And there were, in fact, ferocious resistances and reactions, both in the empire and in the same eastern patriarchates of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria that were politically under the Arab Empire at that time. So this is all the more interesting because, of course, and this tells you how intersected the political issue with the caliphate really was, that Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, of course, under the Muslims, had their notoriously their, quite important and relevant Christian community and all the ecclesiastical administration and so on. And so, given that these territories were ideally to be reconquered by the Roman emperors and still maintain an important ecclesiastical connection with the Constantinopolitan councils and so on, well, the resentment was really hard, right? Same Rome, of course, was opposed to that, as I was saying before. So the imperial court, 30 years later, 754, that is in the time in which the Empress Irene was regent. This is about, like, after a couple of emperors, as you know, her she married the son of Constantine V. After he died, she took this measure, and at that point it's important to see also from the iconodule historiography how important iconoclasm had become properly for the ruling dynasty, right? Because for example, Leo III, that by contemporary sources is not really depicted even as an enemy of the icons, and that is instead traditionally, historiographically identified like he who started the thing first, is instead heavily criticized generations later, actually, when the iconodules were re-triumphing, and describing especially Constantine V, his son, as, let's say, the terrible emperor of Iconoclasm, of course, that was just imitating his own father. And as we were saying before, if you're an emperor, really, and you have to follow dynasties here alternated, and also quite unstably, it was a huge deal to just stick to your, father's ecclesiastical policy, because it was just the meaning of the entire universe. And if you were legitimized as the ruler of such an ecumenic empire, you couldn't really say, sorry, my father was wrong about, this thing about the meaning of the sacred, and so about the entire value system that the world should have. So, no, sorry, I'm just making another policy. No, they would insist on that as well, and naturally would be loaded of political and social and even military meanings that, again, would agglomerate around it more, not just like an excuse, but like a party, right? How many times political factionalism starts from apparently insignificant points, right? And there is so much behind this. But Irene, 30 years later, 754, summoned a new council to revoke the condemnation. This was a clever move in many ways for her, at least. Her reign is very interesting and complicated and terrifying in many ways. But she was the regent. She was not from that family, so she could afford, in that sense, as a woman, as a regent, as just the wife of the former emperor and the mother of the next one, whom she had killed, by the way. And these are the tender family relations in the Byzantine imperial families. To get rid of this problem that surely didn't help her already precarious position, and that would reconcile the factions and hopefully bring to more political cohesion in the empire altogether. This thing had taken also some kind of international character, even with the Western empires. We will see. In fact, there was the second wave in the first half of the 9th century, even after the extinction of the Isaurian dynasty at that point, when iconoclasm was resumed. And you have, in fact, the Byzantine emperor writing to Louis the Pious, starting to complain in the letter about the fact that this representation of the sacred had to be taken away. I imagine Louis the Pious being read this thing and saying, what the hell this guy's talking about? And trying, to see if the Franks would kind of sympathize. But the Franks, were too brutal and rough and, and bloodthirsty and primitive to even care about any of this. They just wanted we're striving to maintain what they had clamorously conquered and controlled. At that point, Louis the Pious was actually an enlightened emperor, but exactly for this reason, he probably said, what the hell is this guy talking about? Or even if he saw himself some maybe political option, it was like, these Greeks that do not want to recognize us as Romans as well. But meaning that, this second iconoclastic wave is still the proof that there was some kind of sound political reason to enact such religious policy, let's say, because otherwise you wouldn't really understand why this connection was needed. Naturally, what was going on in the empire would be the gradual reaffirmation of greater power. And at that point, the need to insist on this homogenization of the representation, etc., would die out, because the same icons and the importance of the centers of the relic that contain them, and the relics and these traditions, etc., would be ever more co-opted in the in fact, more kind of oligarchic nature of the empire. So that at that point, the masses lost ever more importance, even if they lived in the centralized, rich areas with autonomistic pulsions. They would gradually be brought under again. And after all, that iconic tradition was, in fact, part of the local cultures from millennia. And it couldn't really take it out that easily or sensibly. And that's also what the Muslims came to realize at some point. So, in part, iconoclasm can be read under the light of the enormous struggle that at that point early medieval powers were undertaking to just remain alive, right, to stay alive against each other, and the massive problems that were going on politically and strategically. And this ideological push is always more evident in the time of crisis. Right? In time of crisis, you need to reinforce these ideas, these banners around which one to rally from a motivational point of view, because you lack the means to do else. Right? When things go better, you cannot relax. This is a bit the history of culture or civilization. And even in fact, the iconoclast persecution of the first half of the 9th century ended with the imperial restoration of the cult of the icons, with all, in fact, an important theological definition that again is mostly what we study today from the major sources on the topic, that again, however, do contain some ideas that are actually the same ones that the iconoclasts owned. This is particularly interesting, that again, if you really want to know what they thought, unfortunately most of that has been destroyed, etc. We know that there were harsh means even from the iconoclastic side, of course, entire, for example, pages from the reports of councils that were ripped off. They made multiple ones, multiple councils themselves that were meant to be ecumenic, including the 7th one. There were actually 2. One was an iconoclastic, one is not recognized, and eventually the other came for the restoration of the icons. By the way, some councils had already been summoned in previous centuries, kind of discussing in part the issue, right? So it was kind of in the air, and the reason why we find, in fact, basically an iconoclastic legacy in the same iconodual historiography is that, of course, the boundary was more blurred than we think, and the same ideas that at some point, in part, were sensible from the iconoclast side that didn't go, that were good rhetorically, right, dialectically, to support a certain idea that was, however, just an offspring of the main one, and that could be integrated with the eventually the iconodual one, would be taken by the same iconodules. And interestingly enough, monasteries, as we were saying before, survived iconoclasm, right? It's especially the monasteries that won this clash, because their power and their same existence had been gravely threatened during the clash. As we've seen, they were the hotbeds of the, of iconophilia. In many ways, they had founded great part of their identity, local cult and prestige, etc., on those same icons, right? They were the same identity of the monastery of that center. Was still considered as a projection of heavenly Jerusalem in the world to attract the faithful further to that ideal of perfection. It doesn't matter how many, in fact, local, almost crypto-national characters, in a way, that they would basically employ to achieve this purpose, because again, the world was fragmented in that sense. Today we live in a much more homogeneous reality. Paradoxically, yes, we differ a lot because we are part of a more complex system, but the bases are radically homogeneous, nothing compared to those days. I'm speaking in an identitary sense, meaning that the world, again, instead was simpler at the time, was a simpler system, and materially speaking was dramatically homogeneous, but the identities were much more hardcore separated. There were much shorter horizons in that sense. Even though universality was meant to exist, this was meant to exist exactly as an overrule that went even beyond that kind of single identity. In part, the iconoclasm does represent this struggle between the centralizing force and the need of clarity and homogeneity and of a superior idea that cannot take too much form eventually in the world, because still there was some sort of contempt towards the lower element. but that at the same time was could not take away the same base of that world. It was that still functioned with that base, because it was essentially a vassalitic hierarchy, right? Even in the empire, yes, it was not like in the feudal fashion. It was still importantly centralized by a certain degree, but we know what we mean, right? Everything is feudal still today in practice. It's just the realization that if something works locally, you let it work, right? And then you hope that there is in fact a glue, a common ideological base with which you can cooperate and make things work for the greater good. And the victory of the Iconodules was saluted, as we were saying before, as a victory of orthodoxy, because in the doctrinal debates that had accompanied the persecutions, the defenders of the icons had accused the iconoclasts to live in a theological climate of distrust towards the possibility of the divine incarnating intimately in the human and indivisible world, right? And thus to be living in a tradition of Christological heresies. Albeit it's difficult to prove, in fact, that the iconoclasts were actually, in fact, denying incarnation, or having, let's say, an excessive contempt towards matter, in kind of an agnostic direction. I mean, probably, as we were saying before, the broader direction might have been in that sense, but without parting from some fundamentals. The main theological point of the iconoclasts were that, the image of Christ, especially, was to be considered either an Nestorian or a monophysitic heresy, because it was thought that if you want to represent Christ, you cannot do it but doing it in fact, according to the dogmas, that is representing both the divine and human nature, right? And according to, in fact, the Nicene Creed and the condemnation of the other heresies. And they said, if you represent just basically the material part of it, and that's Nestorianism. If you instead want to, because where's the divine nature? In part, also, where's the human nature in an icon, right? You can represent it. They refer to the representation, but again, how can you represent the divine one in essentially the figure of a human being, as Jesus was depicted? So you wouldn't incur into the Nestorian heresy from their perspective. Equally, if you thought that you would be representing accurately also the divine nature, and next to the human one, you would still, however, create a single picture that wouldn't give you the possibility of distinguishing it without any other proof, fundamentally. So what do you think the reason there, right? It's the same picture you have if you represent both natures in one on the icon. Still, that's kind of monophysitism. So these were some points that were eventually debunked, but let's say because again, nobody really thought that the icon would have had to contain really that, right? And that's where the difference between the veneration or worship thing is very meaningful. And so in general, from a theological point of view, the Iconodules pushed towards the idea that there was too much distrust, let's say, towards the physical world and creation itself from the iconoclasts, in fact, by supporting such idea. But historically, the victory achieved on the iconoclasts represented the triumph of harmonizing liturgical expression with the needs of an old artistic culture that was destined to renew itself in the splendor of the Byzantine iconography and the solemn humanity of the Christian East. That could have not been properly possible without such representations. And this is something that in fact goes beyond, and that the same Christianity altogether was going towards with the revival properly of a humanistic character, right, with the celebration of the sacred, in fact, in all its humanity, in all its possibility of connection with it. So it was, in a sense, whatever the reasons that brought to the iconoclasm, there were trends that were going against it on a much bigger scale, that could not properly even be controlled at the time, and that were objectively not really exceeding or, being mistaken from a theological point of view to the point of creating some, in fact, misunderstanding of that level. And it had to do, in fact, with the needs properly to reinforce faith, also through this security, this proximity, this inspiration, and the possibility of the sacred image to elevate also the soul, and to revive faith, to have simply a more personal connection as well with the divine, that is again fruit of an overall improvement of civilization that would have taken place in the following centuries, and that, speaking of the iconoclasm, instead had been had not been needed so much. The 8th century, this general phase of, in fact, also threats of defeats, and especially, in fact, the Byzantine East is different from the West in this regard, was much more imperiled and threatened, and the masses had somewhat become, more uncertain, kind of more insecure, to the point of taking refuge on something more immediate that could seem like these monasteries, these great figures, these great representations, in a more kind of pathetic way, with even in superstitious forms, definitely, that however would have been cleared just by the improvement of the situation. And possibly iconoclasm also served in part to this, because in part kind of struck exactly to these kind of excesses from one side, from the other also triggered this response to that stemmed a more logical, rational approach to the issue from a theological point of view, to reinforce also the beliefs of the less morally resourceful, let's put it in this way, and by disciplining them better and structuring the empire in more solid ways, as it would occur later on in ever more oligarchic and kind of way, at least that restored some greater political cohesion, even at the expense of the central control, a certain degree. So a bit in that feudalizing sense we were saying before, where in fact also the space of the monastery had a fundamental role, especially in the province, where again the local communities were basically all one with these cults and these monastic centers that essentially carried them out in the also in the liturgy, and as part of that community, as part of that identity. In any case, we will talk more about the iconoclasm, also a bit more about the causes and also the consequences in certain specific provinces. But for today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.